When I told Jason I was leaving him, he actually threw his head back and laughed. "Where are you going to go, Cassandra? No one else will put up with your crazy," he said, taking another swig of beer, while I stood there in my work clothes, after a 12-hour shift. "You won't leave me because you can't survive without me." 3 days later, he wasn't laughing when the moving trucks pulled up to our house, the house I'd been secretly buying while he thought he was living rent-free. It was Thursday evening, 8:47 p.m., and I was standing in our cramped kitchen still wearing my hospital scrubs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of antiseptic and exhaustion clung to me like a second skin after another grueling shift in the pediatric ICU. I'd been on my feet for 12 hours straight, dealing with sick children and frantic parents, making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. And here was Jason, exactly where I'd left him that morning, sprawled across our second-hand couch like he owned the place, which was ironic considering he'd never paid a dime toward rent. Empty beer cans formed a protective fortress around him, and that damn PlayStation controller was practically grafted to his hands. He was wearing the same basketball shorts he'd had on for 4 days running, the ones with the mysterious stain on the left leg that I'd stopped asking about. The sink was full of dishes he'd promised to handle 3 days ago. The trash was overflowing with takeout containers, takeout I'd paid for, of course, and clutched in my trembling hand was the final notice for our electric bill. The third utility company threatening to shut us off this month. "Jason," I said, my voice cutting through the mindless explosions coming from his video game. "We need to talk." He didn't even pause the game, just grunted without taking his eyes off the screen, like I was some annoying background noise, interrupting his very important mission to shoot digital enemies. "The electricity is getting shut off tomorrow if we don't pay $347, I continued, holding up the red notice. "That's on top of the gas bill you ignored last week, and the water bill from 2 weeks ago." Another grunt. His character on screen was apparently in some kind of intense firefight that required his complete attention, more important than our actual life falling apart, apparently. "Jason, are you listening to me?" "I heard you," he mumbled, finally hitting pause but still not looking at me. "Just put it on the credit card like always. The credit card that's already maxed out. The one I've been making minimum payments on for 8 months while you figured out your next career move." Now he turned around, and I saw that familiar flash of irritation cross his face. The same expression he got whenever reality dared to intrude on his fantasy world, where responsibilities were optional, and I was some kind of magical money-producing robot. "Look, Cass, I'm stressed enough without you coming home and immediately starting with the nagging. I'm between opportunities right now. You've been between opportunities for 6 months, Jason. Before that, you quit the warehouse job because your manager was disrespectful. Before that, you walked out of the restaurant because they expected you to actually show up on time. And before that, I'm not going to let some corporate asshole treat me like garbage for minimum wage." He snapped, finally setting down the controller and standing up, all 6 feet of mediocrity rising to his full height, like that was supposed to intimidate me. "I have standards, Cassandra. I'm not going to settle for some dead-end job just because you're impatient." I stared at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in months. When had his confidence become delusion? When had his standards become excuses? When had my love become his meal ticket? "Jason, I can't do this anymore," I said quietly. "I can't be the only one working, the only one paying bills, the only one taking care of everything while you wait for the perfect opportunity to fall into your lap." He rolled his eyes, actually rolled his eyes at me, like I was being unreasonable. "So what are you saying, exactly?" "I'm saying get a job, any job. Start contributing to this relationship, or I'm leaving you." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. For a moment, something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe even concern. But then that familiar smirk spread across his lips, and he threw his head back and laughed. Not a chuckle, not a nervous laugh. A full dismissive, patronizing laugh that cut through me like a scalpel. "Where are you going to go, Cassandra?" he said, wiping fake tears from his eyes like my ultimatum was the funniest thing he'd heard all day. "Back to your mother's trailer?" Good luck explaining to her how you couldn't even keep a man who was willing to put up with your crazy. Each word hit like a physical blow, but I stood perfectly still, letting him continue. You work too much. You're always stressed. You nag constantly. You think some other guy is going to want to deal with all that? You think anyone else is going to love someone like you? He moved closer, and I could smell the beer on his breath, see the cruel confidence in his eyes. No one else will put up with your crazy, Cass. You're 34 years old, you have no social life, and you come home every day looking like you've been hit by a truck. You won't leave me because you can't survive without me. Who else is going to love someone like you? The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator I'd bought, in the apartment I'd rented, eating food I'd purchased with money I'd earned, while he spent his days playing pretend war games. You're right, Jason, I said quietly, turning away to hide the small smile playing at my lips. I probably won't leave. I could practically hear his satisfied exhale behind me, the sound of a man who thought he'd just won an argument. He'd put me back in my place, reminded me of my value, or lack thereof. Crisis averted. Meal ticket secured. Good, he said, already reaching for his controller again. Now can we drop the drama? I'm in the middle of a ranked match. I began washing the dishes with methodical precision, my movements calm and controlled. Jason had no idea that his cruel laughter had just sealed his fate. He couldn't see what I was really thinking as I scrubbed his beer-stained glasses and pizza-crusted plates. What Jason didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine in his self-absorbed little world, was that I'd been planning this moment for months. While he thought I was just his devoted, desperate girlfriend who'd never have the courage to leave, I'd been quietly building my escape route. The secret savings account I'd opened under my maiden name, growing steadily with money he didn't even know existed. The credit check I'd run on myself, discovering that my score was excellent despite his attempts to use my cards for his gaming subscriptions and beer runs. The apartment applications I'd already submitted, the consultations with divorce attorneys, the careful documentation of every bill I'd paid and every expense he'd racked up, and most importantly, the house we were standing in. The house Jason assumed we were renting. The house I'd been quietly buying for the past 6 months while he believed his lies about my dependence on him. You see, Jason Reynolds was about to learn the difference between a woman who can't leave and a woman who chooses not to leave, until she's ready. And I was almost ready. As I dried the last dish and hung up the towel, I made a mental note to call the moving company tomorrow. 3 days from now, when those trucks pulled up to collect my belongings, Jason would finally understand what he'd actually lost. His laughter was about to become the most expensive sound of his life. The real turning point didn't come that Thursday night, with Jason's laughter echoing in our kitchen. It came 3 weeks later, on Valentine's Day, when I discovered just how deep his contempt for me actually ran. I'd finished another brutal 12-hour shift in the pediatric ICU. We'd lost a 7-year-old that morning, a car accident victim, whose parents were still in the waiting room when I left, clinging to each other like shipwreck survivors. Days like that reminded me why I became a nurse, why I pushed through the exhaustion and stress. I stopped at the grocery store on my way home, picking up a small bouquet of daisies from the discount rack and takeout from Thai Palace, Jason's favorite pad thai with extra peanut sauce. I know it sounds pathetic now, but I was still trying. Still believing that maybe if I just showed him enough love, he'd remember who we used to be. I pulled into our driveway at 6:30 p.m. and immediately knew my romantic evening was doomed. 3 cars I recognized were parked outside: Martin Sanders' beat-up Honda, Sonny Hayes' pickup truck with the Confederate flag bumper sticker, and some rusty Camaro I didn't know, but could guess, belonged to another one of Jason's unemployed gaming buddies. I walked into our living room, carrying the flowers and takeout like offerings to gods who didn't care. The scene was exactly what I expected: 4 grown men sprawled across our furniture like teenagers, surrounded by empty pizza boxes and beer cans. The coffee table I'd saved 6 months to buy was serving as their personal trash bin. "Happy Valentine's Day, babe," I said, forcing brightness into my voice. "I brought your favorite pad thai." Jason barely glanced up from his phone. "We already ate, there's leftover pizza if you want some." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I thought maybe we could watch a movie together, just us. That's when Martin Sanders decided to offer his wisdom about relationships. Dude, she wants to watch a chick flick, he snorted. Sunny Hayes chimed in. My ex used to pull that romantic bullshit too, so needy. But what came next shattered whatever was left of my illusions about Jason Reynolds. He looked up from his phone and said with that same dismissive laugh, yeah, Cass is like that, always wanting attention, always making everything about feelings. I keep telling her, Valentine's Day is just a scam to make money off desperate women. The unnamed friend with the Camaro laughed. Bro, at least your girl has a job, mine just spends my money all day. And then Jason said the words that would replay in my mind for months. True that. I mean, Cass pays for everything, but she acts like I should be grateful. It's her choice to work so much. Besides, where else is she gonna go? She's lucky I put up with all her neurotic shit. I felt something break inside my chest, not my heart, that had been cracking for months. Something deeper. My sense of self, maybe. The last shred of belief that the man I loved saw me as anything more than a convenient ATM, with benefits. I set down the takeout and flowers without a word. Nobody noticed, they were too busy laughing about something on Martin's phone. I retreated to our bedroom, locking myself in the bathroom. The face staring back at me from the mirror looked like a stranger, exhausted, hollow-eyed, older than her 34 years. When had I become this person? That's when I noticed his phone on the bathroom counter. Jason guarded his phone like state secrets, but tonight he'd been careless. The screen lit up with notifications from a group text, titled, The Boys. I should have walked away, but something made me pick up that phone, and what I saw there changed everything. Martin, dude, your GF, looked pissed about the Valentine's thing. Sunny, maybe she'll finally dump you and you can move in with your mom again, lol. Jason, nah, she's too scared to leave. I've got her trained pretty good. Jason, plus she knows no other guy would deal with her crazy work schedule and mood swings. Jason, exactly. Why work when you've got a nurse girlfriend? It's like having a sugar mama who actually believes she's getting something out of it. My hands started shaking as I continued reading. Martin, what if she finds someone else though? Jason, Lolo, who? She's 34, works constantly, has no social life, and comes with my debt. Good fucking luck to her. Jason, I could cheat on her tomorrow and she'd probably apologize for making me do it. I set the phone back exactly where I'd found it, my mind reeling. 6 years of my life, supporting a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenient source of income and domestic labor. Who spoke about me to his friends like I was some pathetic creature too stupid to know I was being used. But as I stared at my reflection in that bathroom mirror, something unexpected happened. Instead of crumbling, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Clarity, crystal clear, diamond-hard clarity about exactly who Jason Reynolds was, and exactly what I was going to do about it. I opened my laptop that night and created a new email account. Then I started researching. By morning, I had a plan. Jason was right about one thing. I wasn't going to leave him, I was going to disappear. You know, it's funny how clearly you can see the red flags when you're looking backward. At the time when you're 22 and in love, those warning signs look like romantic gestures. Jason's neediness felt like devotion. His financial irresponsibility seemed like carefree spontaneity. I met Jason Reynolds in the fall of 2011, during my senior year at the University of Colorado. I was pre-med then, carrying a full course load while working 20 hours a week at the campus library. My parents had sacrificed everything to get me to college. My dad was a construction worker, and my mom cleaned houses. Jason was everything I thought I wanted. Captain of the intramural soccer team, popular, effortlessly charming. He had this smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, like you were sharing some secret joke. The first time I saw him was in Professor Martinez's organic chemistry class. I was sitting in the front row, frantically taking notes because I knew this material would make or break my MCAT scores. Jason strolled in 15 minutes late, sliding into a seat near the back, with casual confidence that suggested tardiness was just another charming personality trait. After class, he caught up with me in the hallway. "Hey, you're Cassandra, right? Cassandra Rossi?" His voice had this warm, slightly rough quality that made my stomach flutter. "I was wondering, would you maybe want to study together sometime? I'm having trouble keeping up with Martinez's pace, and everyone says you're the smartest person in the class." That should have been my first clue. Not that he was attracted to me, but that I was useful to him. At 22, being needed by someone like Jason felt like being chosen. Our first study session was at the library where I worked. I spent 3 hours walking him through concepts I'd mastered weeks earlier. Jason was a good student when he focused, but he spent half our time together making jokes, telling stories, asking about my family. "You're different from other girls, Cass," he said, as we packed up our books. "You've got substance. You're going somewhere in life." By our third study session, he was asking me out. By our fifth, I was canceling study groups with my pre-med friends to spend time with him. By the end of the semester, my grades started slipping for the first time in my academic career, but I told myself it was worth it. Jason made me feel beautiful, desired, special. The problem started small. Jason had a habit of forgetting his wallet when we went out, leaving me to cover the bill with money from my work-study job. He'd show up at my dorm when I was studying for exams, claiming he missed me too much to wait. "I thought you wanted to spend time with me," he'd say when I explained I needed quiet time to prepare for tests, and somehow I'd end up apologizing for prioritizing my education over his feelings. My roommate, Jane Madeline, tried to warn me. "Cass, he seems to need a lot of taking care of," she said, one night after Jason had spent 4 hours in our room, complaining about his economics professor. "And he doesn't seem very interested in your goals." I defended him, of course. "He just needs someone who believes in him, Jane. What about the pressure you're dealing with? You're pre-med, working part-time, maintaining a 3.8 GPA. When does he support your dreams?" I didn't have a good answer, so I changed the subject. But Jane's words stuck with me. The real shift came during spring semester of our senior year. I'd been accepted to 3 nursing programs. I'd switched from pre-med after realizing I wanted more direct patient contact and couldn't afford medical school debt. Jason was facing graduation with a communications degree and no clear career path. "I've been thinking," he said one evening, "what if we moved in together after graduation? I could look for opportunities in Denver while you start nursing school." It sounded romantic at the time, building a life together, supporting each other's dreams, but something felt uneven about the arrangement. Jason's opportunities were vague, undefined. My nursing program was concrete with guaranteed career prospects. "How will you support yourself while you're looking?" I asked. "Well, I figured you could probably cover rent for a while, just until I get established. You'll be making good money as a nurse, right?" That casual assumption, that my future income was automatically our future income, should have stopped me cold. Instead, I found myself nodding, already calculating how I could make it work. After graduation, we moved into a cramped 1-bedroom apartment in Lakewood. I started my nursing program immediately, juggling classes with a part-time job. Jason moved back in with his parents temporarily, while he figured out his next step. Those 8 months of him living at home, while I struggled to pay rent alone, should have been my wake-up call. But Jason had explanations for everything. The job market was terrible. He wasn't going to settle for just any position. The first time I paid for his gas, groceries and phone bill was presented as a temporary favor. "Just until I get back on my feet, babe." But temporary became permanent, so gradually I barely noticed the transition. Every job Jason quit, every bill that fell to me, somehow became about how I wasn't being supportive enough. By the time I graduated nursing school and started my first job, Jason had been living off my income for over a year, and it felt normal. It felt like love. I had no idea I was raising the man who would one day laugh at the thought of me leaving him. The transformation from equal partners to me becoming Jason's personal ATM didn't happen overnight. It was so gradual, so expertly executed, that I didn't even realize I was being systematically erased from my own life until it was almost complete. During my first year as a registered nurse, I was making $52,000 annually, stable income that should have easily supported both of us, while Jason established his career. He'd finally found what he called a real opportunity as a sales associate at an electronics store, enthusiastic for exactly 6 weeks. "The manager is a complete micromanager," he complained one evening. "He expects me to push extended warranties on people who clearly can't afford them. I'm not going to compromise my integrity for some corporate policy." He quit the next day. No 2 weeks' notice, no attempt at compromise, just walked out during lunch and never went back. "Don't worry," he assured me. "I've got some leads already. This might actually be a blessing in disguise. Now I can focus on finding something that really fits my skill set." Those leads never materialized. But Jason always had explanations. The economy was tough. Companies weren't hiring people with his level of education for entry-level positions. He was being selective because he didn't want to get stuck in another dead-end situation. Meanwhile, our expenses somehow kept increasing. Jason needed a gym membership to maintain his physical health for job interviews. He needed new clothes because presentation matters in sales. He needed a better phone for networking calls. Every expense was framed as an investment in our future. And somehow I was always the one funding these investments. The real erosion began when I started talking about advancing my career. I'd been working at Denver Presbyterian for 18 months when my supervisor approached me about applying for a charge nurse position. "You have natural leadership skills, Cassandra," Linda Chang told me. "The other nurses respect you, doctors trust your judgment. I think you'd be perfect for the pediatric ICU charge nurse role." The position would mean a $12,000 salary increase and put me on track for eventual management roles. I'd been dreaming of healthcare administration since nursing school. When I told Jason about the opportunity, his reaction wasn't what I expected. "That sounds like a lot more responsibility," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "Are you sure you want to take on that kind of stress? It's career advancement, and the salary increase would really help us financially." "Money isn't everything, Cass. What's the point of making more if you're too burned out to enjoy life?" I paused, confused by his lack of enthusiasm. "I thought you'd be excited. This is exactly what I've been working toward. I just worry about you. You put so much pressure on yourself already. Adding management responsibility, that seems like a recipe for a breakdown." His concern felt genuine, and I was touched that he was looking out for my well-being. But something nagged at me. When I'd supported his decision to quit 3 different jobs in pursuit of better opportunities, he'd called it refusing to settle. When I wanted to advance my career, it was too much stress. I applied anyway and got the position. The day I received the promotion, I called Jason from the hospital, barely able to contain my excitement. "That's great, babe," he said, but his voice was flat. "Does this mean you'll be working even longer hours?" Not congratulation, not pride in my achievement. Just immediate concern about how my success would affect him. The pattern became clearer over the following months. Every milestone in my career was met with subtle discouragement disguised as concern. When I mentioned wanting to pursue my master's degree, Jason worried about student loan debt. When I talked about attending nursing conferences, he complained about being left alone. "I feel like I never see you anymore," became his standard response to any discussion of my professional goals. "Sometimes I wonder if your job is more important to you than our relationship." The gaslighting was so skillful that I started questioning my own priorities. Was I being selfish for wanting career advancement? Was I neglecting our relationship by focusing on professional development? So I started saying no. No to the conference in Chicago, no to the committee position, no to the overtime shifts that would have boosted our savings. And with each no, I felt myself shrinking a little more. The financial dynamics shifted too. When Jason first moved in, we talked about splitting expenses fairly. But as his employment became sporadic, and my salary increased, fair became increasingly subjective. "It doesn't make sense for me to pay half when you make 3 times what I do," Jason reasoned after quitting his 4th job. "Proportional contribution is more equitable." Proportional contribution meant I paid everything while Jason's sporadic income covered his personal spending. gaming subscriptions, beer, marijuana, dinners with friends. By my third year as a nurse, I was supporting him almost entirely, and somehow he'd convinced me it was collaborative rather than exploitation. The final piece of my identity that Jason systematically dismantled was my social life. It started with subtle comments about my friendships. "Jane seems really judgmental," he'd say after my former roommate visited. "My friends from nursing school are all so competitive. Your family treats me like I'm some kind of deadbeat." Gradually, I found myself declining invitations to avoid Jason's inevitable analysis. It was easier to stay home than deal with his hurt feelings. By the time I realized what had happened, I was completely isolated. No close friendships, no family relationships that hadn't been strained, no professional networks. I had become exactly what Jason needed me to be: a high-earning, socially isolated woman, whose entire identity revolved around supporting his comfort while abandoning her own dreams. The most insidious part was that he'd convinced me it was love. The signs were always there. Looking back, I can't believe how obvious they were. How many times Jason showed me exactly who he was while I convinced myself I was seeing something else. But when you're living inside the situation, when you've been gradually conditioned to question your own perceptions, red flags just look like minor personality quirks that love should overlook. The financial inconsistencies started becoming impossible to ignore around our fourth year together. I was making $58,000 as a charge nurse, working 50-hour weeks, and somehow we were always broke. Not just tight on money, actually broke. Overdraft fees, late payment penalties, credit cards maxed out despite the fact that my income should have easily covered our modest lifestyle. I started paying closer attention to where our money was going, and what I discovered made my stomach drop. Jason's personal expenses had somehow ballooned into a second household budget that I was unknowingly funding. His Amazon account showed constant deliveries, gaming equipment, craft beer subscription boxes, workout supplements he never used, clothes he wore once and left in piles on our bedroom floor. His Venmo history revealed a steady stream of payments to his friends: $50 here for poker night, $30 there for someone's birthday dinner, $25 for his share of a weekend cabin rental I'd never been invited to. When I confronted him about the spending, Jason's defense was immediate and practiced. "Those are networking expenses, Cass. You have to invest in relationships if you want professional opportunities. My friends work in different industries. You never know where the next lead might come from. Spending $60 on craft beer is networking. It's about being part of the community. You wouldn't understand because you work in healthcare where everything is structured and formal. In the business world, relationships matter more than resumes." The business world. As if Jason had any meaningful connection to the business world beyond his LinkedIn profile that listed him as seeking opportunities in strategic development. But the money was just the surface level. The real red flags were behavioral, and they were getting harder to ignore. Jason had developed an obsessive need to know my schedule at all times, not in a romantic, "I miss you" way, in a controlling, inventory-taking way. He'd text me throughout my shifts, asking when I'd be home, who I was working with, whether I was picking up overtime. If I didn't respond immediately, he'd send follow-up messages with increasingly irritated tones. "Hello? I asked you a question. Are you ignoring me? It takes 2 seconds to text back. I guess your coworkers are more important than your boyfriend." When I explained that I couldn't constantly check my phone during patient care, that people's lives literally depended on my attention, Jason's response was always the same: "Other people manage to stay in touch with their partners during work. Maybe you're just not prioritizing our relationship." The isolation tactics became more aggressive too. Jason started having opinions about every person in my life, and those opinions were consistently negative. My nursing school friend Sarah invited me to her wedding shower, and Jason suddenly had concerns about her superficial values and materialistic lifestyle. My colleague Mike, who'd become a good friend through our shared interests in healthcare policy, was clearly trying to get with me despite being happily married with 3 kids. My own sister was jealous of our relationship and trying to cause drama whenever she asked innocent questions about how Jason was doing with his job search. "I'm not saying you can't see these people," Jason would clarify, employing the classic manipulation technique of offering theoretical freedom while making the actual exercise of that freedom emotionally costly. I just think you should be aware of their motivations. I'm looking out for you because I love you. The most disturbing pattern was how Jason had started monitoring my personal habits and appearance. He'd make casual comments about my weight if I skipped a day at the gym due to exhaustion from work. He'd suggest I dress more professionally if I wore comfortable scrubs instead of the fitted ones that were harder to move in during long shifts. I just want you to feel confident, he'd say when I pointed out that comfort mattered more than appearance in my job. You've been looking tired lately, maybe some makeup would help you feel more put together. I was looking tired because I was tired. I was working 50-hour weeks, managing our entire household, and somehow still finding energy to boost Jason's ego when he was feeling insecure about his lack of employment. But instead of addressing the root cause of my exhaustion, Jason focused on managing the symptoms that made him uncomfortable. The gaslighting reached peak intensity whenever I tried to discuss our relationship dynamics. If I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by managing all our finances alone, Jason would accuse me of keeping score and making everything transactional. If I expressed frustration about doing all the housework while he played video games, I was nagging and creating conflict over minor issues. "You used to be so easygoing," became his standard response to any attempt at addressing problems. "I don't know what happened to the girl I fell in love with. You've become so stressed and negative about everything." What had happened to that girl was 6 years of having her boundaries systematically violated, and her reality constantly questioned. But Jason had convinced me that my increasing resistance to his manipulation was evidence of my personal failings rather than healthy self-preservation. The final red flag that I couldn't ignore was Jason's relationship with work itself. It wasn't just that he couldn't keep jobs, it was his fundamental attitude toward the concept of employment. In Jason's worldview, having to work for someone else was beneath him. Following schedules was restrictive. Meeting expectations was oppressive. "I'm not built for the corporate grind," he'd explain after quitting yet another position. "I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I just need to find the right opportunity to start my own thing." But Jason never took any concrete steps toward starting his own business. No business plans, no market research, no networking with actual entrepreneurs. His entrepreneurial spirit consisted entirely of rejecting conventional employment while contributing nothing productive to our shared life. Meanwhile, I was watching my nursing colleagues advance their careers, pursue specializations, take on leadership roles. I was seeing other women my age buy houses, start families, build lives that reflected their values and ambitions. And I was going home every night to a man who seemed to believe that my success existed solely to subsidize his comfort. The cognitive dissonance was becoming impossible to maintain. On one hand, I had a career I loved, colleagues who respected me, and a growing reputation as a skilled and reliable nurse. On the other hand, I had a personal life where my worth was measured entirely by my willingness to suppress my own needs in service of someone else's ego. Something had to give. I just didn't realize yet that Jason's contemptuous laughter on Valentine's Day would be the catalyst that finally gave me permission to trust my own perceptions instead of his version of reality. The red flags had been waving for years. I was finally ready to stop pretending they were just decorative banners celebrating our love. After reading those text messages on Valentine's Day, I became a different person overnight. Not broken, not defeated, but calculating. For the first time in years, I stopped trying to see Jason through the lens of love and started seeing him through the lens of evidence. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm and lay in bed listening to Jason snore beside me. The man who'd spent months telling me how lucky I was to have him, who'd convinced me that my concerns about our relationship were evidence of my own insecurity and neediness. I watched his face in the early morning light and felt nothing but clinical curiosity about how long this performance had been going on. I started documenting everything, not dramatically, not obviously, just paying attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to for years. I created a private note in my phone titled Household Management and began logging our daily interactions like a researcher, studying an interesting but destructive social phenomenon. Tuesday, February 15th, Jason slept until 1:30 p.m. When he woke up, complained about being exhausted, and needing to recover from yesterday's social activities. Ate leftover pizza for breakfast while I prepared for my evening shift, asked me to pick up energy drinks on my way home, because getting motivated is hard when you're this drained. Did not acknowledge that I worked a 12-hour shift yesterday, and still cooked dinner for his friends. Wednesday, February 16th, Jason applied to one job online, took 20 minutes, counted as full day of job hunting, spent remaining 8 hours playing Call of Duty with Martin and Sunny. When I suggested he might expand his search beyond entry-level retail positions, he accused me of not believing in his potential and being unsupportive during a difficult time. The patterns became impossible to ignore when you wrote them down. Jason's version of a productive day consisted of the bare minimum effort required to deflect criticism, followed by hours of leisure activities funded by my income. His emotional manipulation followed predictable scripts. Any suggestion for improvement was reframed as personal attack. Any request for accountability became evidence of my unreasonable expectations. But the real revelation came when I started tracking our finances with the same methodical attention I brought to patient care. I opened a spreadsheet and began recording every expense, every transaction, every dollar that flowed through our shared accounts. What I discovered was staggering. In the 6 months since Jason had quit his last job, our household expenses had actually decreased. We were eating out less, buying fewer groceries, spending less on entertainment that we both enjoyed. But Jason's personal spending had increased dramatically. His individual purchases now exceeded what we used to spend together on everything beyond basic necessities. $65 for a new gaming headset because his old one was affecting his performance. $43 for premium craft beer that he consumed alone while I was at work. $87 for workout clothes, despite the fact that his gym membership, which I paid for, hadn't been used in 3 months. The numbers painted a picture of someone who had no intention of reducing his lifestyle to match his contribution. I started taking pictures of receipts, screenshots of bank statements, photos of delivery boxes piling up in our living room, not because I was planning anything specific yet, but because I needed external validation that my perceptions were accurate. Jason had spent so many years convincing me that my memory was unreliable, my interpretations unfair, my expectations unreasonable. I needed proof that I could trust my own observations. The most damning evidence came from Jason's own digital carelessness. He'd grown so comfortable with his manipulation, so confident in my submission, that he'd stopped being careful about hiding his true thoughts and activities. His browser history, which he'd never bothered to clear, revealed hours spent on Reddit forums complaining about entitled women and gold diggers, despite the fact that he was literally being supported by a woman's gold. His search history included phrases like how to get girlfriend to stop nagging about job, and why do women always want to change you. Most telling were his social media interactions. Jason had been commenting on his friends' posts with casual misogyny that would have horrified me if I'd seen it earlier. Jokes about training your woman, memes about high-maintenance girlfriends, and constant complaints about how exhausting it was to deal with women's emotional needs. But it was his online dating activity that finally shattered any remaining illusions I might have had about salvaging our relationship. While going through his email to find a warranty for a purchase he'd asked me to handle, I discovered he'd been maintaining active profiles on 3 different dating apps. Not just old accounts he'd forgotten to delete, recently active profiles with photos taken in our apartment, descriptions that painted him as single and focusing on building his consulting business. The messages were worse than I could have imagined. Jason had been telling potential dates that he was recently out of a long-term relationship with someone who didn't understand his entrepreneurial ambitions. He'd been scheduling coffee dates for times when he knew I'd be at work, describing himself as financially independent and looking for someone who shares his values of independence and ambition. The irony was so thick I actually laughed out loud while reading his messages. Jason, who hadn't earned enough money in 6 months to cover his beer budget, was presenting himself to other women as financially independent. Jason, who lived entirely off my nursing salary, was seeking someone who valued independence. I screenshotted everything, every message, every profile, every conversation where he'd described his current situation in terms that bore no resemblance to reality. Not because I was planning to confront him with the evidence, I was long past believing that showing Jason proof of his hypocrisy would lead to accountability or change. I was documenting everything because I was building a case, not a legal case, necessarily, but a personal one. A comprehensive record that would prevent me from second-guessing myself when the time came to act. The surveillance phase lasted exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks of watching Jason with clear eyes, of documenting his behavior without the filter of love or hope or wishful thinking. 3 weeks of seeing him not as the man I'd fallen in love with in college, but as the man he'd actually become, or maybe always was. By the end of those 3 weeks, I had enough evidence to fill a small filing cabinet. Financial records, text messages, dating profiles, browser history, and page after page of daily observations that painted a picture of someone who viewed me as a convenient resource rather than a human being worthy of respect. But more importantly, I had something I hadn't possessed in years: absolute certainty about my own perceptions. Jason hadn't been slowly changing over time, gradually becoming more selfish and manipulative. He'd been showing me exactly who he was from the beginning, and I'd been working so hard to see the best in him that I'd ignored the evidence of my own eyes. The confirmation phase was complete. Now it was time to start planning my disappearance from his life. And Jason, comfortable in his conviction that I'd never leave him, had no idea that his world was about to change forever. The hardest part about planning my escape wasn't the logistics, it was maintaining the performance. Every morning, I had to wake up and pretend to be the same woman who'd spent 6 years believing Jason's lies about my worth, my capabilities, my options. I had to smile when he made dismissive comments about my mood swings, nod sympathetically when he complained about the impossible job market, and continue funding his lifestyle while secretly building my exit strategy. But I'd become an excellent actress over the years. 6 years of pretending Jason's failures were temporary setbacks had trained me well for pretending I wasn't planning to vanish from his life entirely. The first step was financial independence, which turned out to be easier than I'd expected. Jason had been so confident in my dependence that he'd never bothered to monitor my money management closely. As long as his personal expenses were covered and our bills were paid, he assumed I was living paycheck to paycheck just like him. What Jason didn't know was that nurses who work strategically can make significantly more than their base salary suggests. I started picking up every overtime shift available, telling Jason I was trying to build up our emergency fund. I began working extra shifts at a private clinic on my days off, describing it as professional development. I took on additional responsibilities that came with small pay bumps, explaining to Jason that career advancement would benefit both of us. Every additional dollar went into a savings account Jason didn't know existed. I'd opened it at a credit union across town, using my maiden name and my work address for all correspondence. Within 6 weeks, I had $3,200 saved, more money than Jason had contributed to our household in the previous 6 months. But money was just the foundation. The real preparation required planning my entire new life while living inside my old one. I started by reconnecting with people Jason had systematically encouraged me to drift away from. My nursing school friend Sarah, who'd invited me to events I'd declined because Jason found her judgmental. My colleague Mike, who'd suggested professional networking opportunities I'd skipped because Jason worried I was prioritizing work over our relationship. My sister Emma, whose calls I'd been answering less frequently because Jason complained that family drama was stressing me out. The conversations were awkward at first. How do you explain that you've been isolating yourself to manage your boyfriend's insecurities without admitting that your relationship is fundamentally broken? How do you rebuild friendships you've neglected without revealing that you're planning to disappear from your current life? I started small, coffee dates with Sarah, where I gradually steered conversations toward her successful marriage, her career growth, her general happiness. I listened to her describe what healthy relationships actually looked like: partners who celebrated each other's achievements, who contributed equally to shared responsibilities, who maintained individual friendships and interests without jealousy or manipulation. "You seem different lately," Sarah observed during our third coffee meeting. "More like yourself, if that makes sense. You've been so stressed the past few years." I wanted to tell her everything, about the text messages, the dating profiles, the systematic erosion of my self-worth. But I couldn't risk Jason discovering my planning process, and Sarah was the type of person who would want to help in ways that might reveal my intentions. I've been doing some thinking about priorities, I said instead, trying to focus more on what actually makes me happy. Good for you, she replied. You deserve to be happy, Cass. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The professional networking was more strategic. I reached out to former colleagues who'd moved to other hospitals, mentioning casually that I was always interested in new opportunities. I joined online groups for nursing professionals, participating in discussions about career development and workplace satisfaction. I updated my resume for the first time in 3 years, highlighting accomplishments Jason had trained me to minimize. What I discovered was that my value in the job market had grown significantly during the years I'd been doubting myself. Charge nurses with my experience and track record were in high demand. Several hospitals were offering signing bonuses for experienced pediatric ICU nurses. The salary ranges I was seeing were $15,000 to $20,000 higher than what I'd thought possible. I started applying for positions, not just locally but in other cities entirely. Denver had become a prison, where every location held memories of compromising myself for Jason's comfort. I needed a complete fresh start, somewhere I could rebuild my identity without constant reminders of who I'd allowed myself to become. The apartment hunting was the most dangerous part of my preparation. I couldn't visit properties in person without risking discovery, so I relied on virtual tours and video calls with leasing agents. I researched neighborhoods with good public transportation, close to hospitals where I might want to work, far enough from our current location that Jason would never stumble across me accidentally. Finding the perfect place felt like destiny. A one-bedroom apartment in Boulder, 30 miles from our current location, but might as well have been on another planet. It was in a complex that catered to healthcare professionals, with flexible lease terms and move-in dates. The rent was actually lower than what we were paying for our current place, which meant I could afford to live comfortably on my salary alone, a concept that felt revolutionary after years of financial stress. I submitted an application using my work address and cell phone number, providing references from colleagues who knew me professionally, rather than personally. When the leasing agent called to confirm my approval, I was sitting in my car during my lunch break, 20 miles from home where Jason couldn't accidentally overhear. Congratulations, Miss Rossi, she said. Your application has been approved. When would you like to schedule your move-in? Miss Rossi. I hadn't been called by my maiden name in 6 years, and hearing it felt like remembering a song I'd loved but forgotten. Cassandra Rossi was someone who made her own decisions, who trusted her own judgment, who didn't need anyone's permission to live her life according to her own values. I'll need about 2 weeks to coordinate everything, I told her. Is March 15th available? March 15th, the date I would stop being Jason's live-in ATM and start being myself again. The moving logistics required military-level planning. I couldn't hire a traditional moving company without leaving a paper trail Jason might discover. Instead, I found a service that specialized in emergency relocations, situations where people needed to move quickly and quietly for safety reasons. They were expensive, but they could pack and transport my belongings in a single day with minimal advance notice. I started mentally cataloging what I would take versus what I would leave behind. The furniture we'd bought together could stay. Most of it had been chosen to impress Jason's friends rather than because I actually liked it. The kitchen equipment I'd accumulated during 6 years of being the only person who cooked could come with me. My clothes, my books, my personal items that had been gradually crowded out by Jason's expanding collection of gaming equipment and impulse purchases. Most importantly, I would take my professional credentials, my financial records, and my dignity. Everything else was just stuff, and stuff could be replaced. As March 15th approached, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in years. Not the exhausted resignation I'd mistaken for peace during the worst periods of our relationship, but actual serenity born from knowing I was taking control of my life again. Jason had no idea that his dismissive laughter had triggered the most sophisticated exit strategy he'd ever encounter. In his mind, I was still the broken-down woman who'd accept any treatment rather than face the world alone. He was about to discover how wrong he'd been about everything. March 14th arrived like any other day, except it wasn't. It was the last day Jason Reynolds would wake up believing he had complete control over my life. The last day he'd assume his comfort was my highest priority. The last day he'd take for granted that his laughter could keep me trapped in a relationship where I'd forgotten my own worth. I went through my morning routine with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed every moment. Shower, coffee, uniform, the same pediatric ICU scrubs I'd worn hundreds of times, but today they felt like armor. I was going to work as Cassandra Hayes for the final time. Tomorrow I would wake up as Cassandra Rossi in an apartment Jason didn't know existed, starting a job he'd never heard about, living a life he couldn't touch. Jason was still asleep when I left for my shift, sprawled across our bed in his boxers, mouth open, completely oblivious to the fact that this was goodbye. I stood in the doorway for exactly 30 seconds, not feeling nostalgic or sad, just marveling at how small he looked when he wasn't actively manipulating someone. Without his practiced charm, his defensive anger, his elaborate justifications for his failures, Jason was just a 36-year-old man who'd spent 6 years avoiding responsibility while someone else funded his extended adolescence. I closed the door quietly and drove to work for my final shift at Denver Presbyterian. My colleagues had no idea I was leaving. I'd given my official notice to Linda Chang, my supervisor, with a story about family obligations requiring me to relocate. No drama, no detailed explanations, just the minimum information required for a professional transition. But I couldn't leave without saying proper goodbyes to the people who'd become my real family over the past 6 years. These were the relationships Jason had tried to minimize, the connections he'd dismissed as work friends, who couldn't possibly understand what we had together. "I'm going to miss working with you," I told Maria Santos during our lunch break. Maria was the nurse who'd trained me when I first started, who'd covered my shifts when I was sick, who'd celebrated every promotion and achievement Jason had barely acknowledged. "This opportunity in Boulder sounds amazing," she replied, because that's how I'd framed my departure, as career advancement rather than escape. "You deserve all the success in the world, Cassandra. You're one of the best nurses I've ever worked with." Maria's words hit harder than I expected. For 6 years I'd been receiving professional recognition and respect while being told at home that I was difficult, needy, unreasonable. The cognitive dissonance had been slowly driving me insane, making me question my competence in every area of my life. "Can I ask you something?" I said impulsively. "Do you think I'm high maintenance, like too demanding or emotional?" Maria looked genuinely puzzled. "Are you serious? Cass, you're literally the calmest person on this floor. During emergencies, during family crises, during the worst situations we deal with, you're steady, professional, and incredibly competent. Where is this coming from?" I felt tears threatening for the first time in weeks. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief. Jason's version of me, the neurotic, oversensitive woman who was lucky anyone tolerated her, was a complete fiction designed to keep me grateful for scraps of affection. "Just something someone said," I replied. "Thank you for being such a good friend all these years." The rest of my shift flew by in a blur of patient care and final preparations. I cleaned out my locker, said casual goodbyes to colleagues without making it seem dramatic, and finished my documentation with the same thoroughness I'd brought to every day of my career. At 7:30 p.m., I drove home to begin the final act of my performance. Jason was exactly where I expected him to be, on the couch, controller in hand, empty beer cans creating their familiar fortress around his command center. The TV was blasting some action movie while he simultaneously played online games and scrolled through his phone. The picture of productivity and ambition. "Hey babe," he said without looking up. "How was work?" "Long day," I replied, which was true in ways he couldn't imagine. "We need to talk about something." That got his attention. Jason paused his game and turned around, immediately shifting into defensive mode. 6 years of experience had taught him that "we need to talk" usually meant I was going to bring up something uncomfortable like bills, responsibilities, or his complete lack of contribution to our relationship. "What's wrong now?" he asked, and I could hear the irritation already creeping into his voice. I sat down across from him, maintaining the same calm demeanor I used with agitated patients and their families. I've been thinking about our conversation a few weeks ago, about my leaving. Jason's expression shifted from defensive to patronizing. Cass, we've been through this. You were upset about work stress, you said some things you didn't mean. It's fine. We don't need to keep rehashing it. Actually, we do need to talk about it, I continued. Because I realize you were right about some things. Now I had his full attention. Jason loved being right, especially when it meant I was admitting to being wrong about something important. Right about what? He asked, leaning forward slightly. You were right that I won't leave you, I said, watching his shoulders relax, as he settled back into his comfortable assumptions. At least not the way you think I would. Exactly, Jason said, his voice taking on that familiar lecturing tone. Look, I know I was harsh that night, but sometimes you need to hear reality. We work as a couple because we balance each other out. You're practical and responsible, I'm more flexible and creative. You handle the day-to-day stuff, I focus on the big picture. It's a good system. I nodded thoughtfully, as if I was seriously considering his analysis of our system. The system where I handled literally everything while he focused on the big picture of his own comfort. You're absolutely right, I agreed. I am practical and responsible. And you're right that someone like me needs someone like you. Jason's smile was so self-satisfied I almost felt sorry for what was coming. Almost. I'm glad you see it that way, he said. I was worried you were going to do something crazy and mess up what we have here. Oh, I would never do anything crazy, I assured him. In fact, I've been thinking about how to make our arrangement even better. Better how? I took a deep breath, savoring this moment. After 6 years of swallowing my words, of editing my thoughts to protect his ego, of making myself smaller to accommodate his massive sense of entitlement, I was finally going to tell Jason Reynolds exactly what I thought of him and his system. But first, I wanted to give him one last chance to show me who he really was. Well, I said carefully, I've been offered an amazing opportunity at work, a promotion that would mean more money, better benefits, real career advancement. But it would require some changes in our routine. Jason's eyes lit up at the mention of more money. What kind of changes? I'd need to work some different shifts, maybe travel occasionally for training. It would mean you'd have to be more independent for a while. Maybe even get a job to help cover expenses while I'm establishing myself in the new role. The change in Jason's expression was instantaneous. The interested smile vanished, replaced by that familiar look of entitled irritation. Wait, so this opportunity means I have to completely restructure my life to accommodate your career? That doesn't sound like a promotion, Cass. That sounds like you prioritizing work over our relationship again. And there it was. The same selfishness, the same manipulation, the same complete inability to consider anyone's needs but his own. Even when presented with the possibility of improved finances and my professional growth, Jason's immediate concern was how it might inconvenience him. You're right, I said quietly. It's not fair to ask you to change. Exactly, Jason said, settling back into his cushions with satisfaction. Besides, we're doing fine as we are. Why rock the boat? I stood up slowly, smoothing down my scrubs one last time. You know what, Jason? You're absolutely right about everything. We shouldn't rock the boat. And with that, I walked into our bedroom to collect the single suitcase I'd packed and hidden in my closet that morning. Tomorrow, when the moving trucks arrived, Jason would discover exactly what not rocking the boat looked like when the boat's captain finally abandoned ship. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. on March 15th, 3 hours before Jason's alarm would even consider going off. The silence in our apartment felt different, not peaceful, but expectant, like the calm before a storm that only I knew was coming. I lay in bed for exactly 5 minutes, listening to Jason's deep, untroubled breathing, the sound of a man who'd never once questioned whether he deserved the life someone else was funding for him. Today was moving day, but Jason didn't know that yet. I slipped out of bed with the stealth I'd perfected over years of early nursing shifts, gathering my pre-staged clothes from the dresser drawer I'd secretly reorganized yesterday. In the bathroom, I looked at myself in the mirror one last time as a resident of this apartment, as Jason's live-in ATM, as someone who'd forgotten her own worth so completely that 6 years had passed before she remembered her name used to be Cassandra Rossi. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who'd stood in this same spot 3 weeks ago after reading those text messages. Her posture was straighter, her eyes clearer, her expression calmer. She looked like someone who'd made a decision and was at peace with it. I dressed quietly in jeans and a comfortable sweater, clothes appropriate for supervising a move, not for going to work. I wouldn't be returning to Denver Presbyterian today. I'd already started my new position at Boulder Community Hospital, a transition I'd arranged with the efficiency that comes from being genuinely competent at planning and execution, despite years of being told I was disorganized and unreliable. By 6 a.m., I was sitting at our kitchen table with coffee and my phone, making final coordination calls in whispered tones. "Good morning. This is Cassandra," I said, when the moving company answered. "I wanted to confirm our 8 a.m. arrival time." "Absolutely, Miss Rossi. We have 3 team members scheduled, and we estimate about 4 hours for packing and transport to your new location. You mentioned you'd prepared most items already." "Everything's ready," I confirmed. "And you have the address for pickup. 2247, Maple Street, Unit B. We'll be there at 8 sharp." I hung up and immediately dialed my new apartment complex. "Boulder Creek Apartments, this is Jennifer." "Hi Jennifer, this is Cassandra Rossi. I wanted to confirm that my keys will be ready for pickup this afternoon." "Of course, we have everything prepared. Your lease begins today, and maintenance finished the final cleaning yesterday. You're all set to move in whenever you're ready." Each confirmation call felt like another lock clicking open on the prison I'd built around myself. For 6 years, I'd convinced myself that leaving Jason would be complicated, expensive, emotionally devastating. The reality was surprisingly straightforward when you approached it like the logistical challenge it actually was, rather than the romantic tragedy I'd been trained to see it as. At 7:30 a.m., I heard Jason's alarm buzz in the bedroom. The sound of his phone hitting the snooze button echoed through our thin walls, followed by his groaned 5 more minutes that would inevitably become 30 more minutes. Some things never changed. I poured a second cup of coffee and waited. Jason emerged from the bedroom at 8:15 a.m., shuffling into the kitchen in his boxers and the same t-shirt he'd slept in for 3 nights. His hair was sticking up at odd angles, and he squinted at me with the confused irritation of someone whose routine had been disrupted. "Why are you dressed already?" he asked, scratching his stomach. "Don't you work tonight?" "I called in sick," I said calmly. "I thought we should spend some time together today, talk about things." Jason's expression shifted to suspicious concern. In his experience, me wanting to talk about things usually meant I was going to bring up uncomfortable topics like his unemployment, our finances, or his complete lack of contribution to our household. But I delivered the news in such a pleasant, reasonable tone that he seemed unsure how to interpret it. "Talk about what things?" he asked, cautiously. "Our relationship, our future." As I watched Jason's internal calculation play out across his face, on one hand, relationship conversations were tedious and potentially led to expectations he had no intention of meeting. On the other hand, I seemed to be in an unusually agreeable mood, and he'd learned to capitalize on those rare moments when I wasn't nagging him about responsibilities. "Okay," he said slowly. "Let me grab some coffee first." As Jason moved around the kitchen with his usual morning lethargy, I heard the rumble of a large truck pulling up outside our building. Right on time, I glanced at my phone, 8:03 a.m. "That's a big truck," Jason observed, glancing out our kitchen window. "Someone's moving today." "Looks like it," I agreed. Jason settled across from me at our small dining table with his coffee, still wearing his confused expression. "So what did you want to talk about?" I took a sip of my coffee, savoring what would be the last conversation we'd ever have in this apartment. "I've been thinking about what you said a few weeks ago, about me leaving you." His body language immediately relaxed. We were back on familiar territory, me acknowledging that his perspective had been correct, him graciously accepting my admission of being wrong, and he prompted. "You were absolutely right. I won't leave you." Jason's smile was pure satisfaction. "I knew you'd come around. You just needed time to think it through logically instead of emotionally. Exactly, I said. I realize that everything you've been telling me is true. I am difficult to live with. I do work too much. I am demanding and unreasonable about wanting equal partnership in a relationship. Jason nodded along, apparently seeing nothing wrong with agreeing that his girlfriend of 6 years was fundamentally flawed. And you're right that no one else would want to deal with someone like me, I continued. Someone who expects her partner to contribute financially, who wants adult conversations about shared responsibilities, who thinks love should involve mutual respect and support. See, I've been trying to help you understand this for years, Jason said, his tone taking on that familiar lecturing quality. You set these impossible standards and then get upset when real relationships don't match some fantasy in your head. The sound of truck doors slamming outside was clearly audible, followed by voices and the scrape of equipment being unloaded. Jason glanced toward the window again, but didn't seem particularly concerned. So I've made a decision, I said. Good, Jason replied. What kind of decision? I've decided you're absolutely right about everything. I shouldn't leave you. Jason's grin was triumphant. I'm glad you finally see. Instead, I interrupted quietly. I'm going to disappear. The confusion on Jason's face was immediate and complete. What does that mean? It means I'm not leaving you, Jason. I'm simply ceasing to exist in your life. There's a difference. Before he could respond, there was a firm knock on our front door. Jason looked toward the sound, then back at me, his expression shifting from confusion to the first stirrings of alarm. Cassandra, he said slowly, what's going on? I stood up from the table, smoothing down my sweater with hands that weren't shaking at all. Those are the movers, Jason. They're here to collect my belongings. Your belongings. Everything that's actually mine. Everything I bought with money I earned. Everything that belongs to Cassandra Rossi rather than Jason Reynolds' live-in financial support system. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. You can't be serious, Jason said. But his voice had lost its confident edge. This is some kind of joke, right? You're trying to make a point? I walked to the front door and opened it to reveal 3 professional movers with dollies and equipment, exactly as scheduled. Good morning, Miss Rossi, the lead mover said. We're ready to get started whenever you are. Perfect timing, I replied. Everything that's leaving is marked with blue tape. Everything unmarked stays with the apartment. Jason appeared behind me in the hallway, still in his boxers, his hair still sticking up, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to panic to anger. Excuse me, he said to the movers. There's been some kind of mistake. This is my apartment. The lead mover looked at me questioningly. I pulled out my phone and showed him the lease agreement I'd photographed weeks earlier. The lease that had always been in my name only, paid with my money, secured with my credit. Actually, I said calmly, this has always been my apartment. Jason, you've just been living in it. The look on Jason's face when he realized he'd been living in my apartment for 6 years was almost worth the entire ordeal. Almost. But what he didn't know yet, what would make this moment even more devastating, was the depth of research I'd conducted into his activities, while he thought I was just his oblivious, devoted ATM. Wait, Jason said, his voice rising as the movers began efficiently dismantling what he'd assumed was our shared life. You can't just kick me out. I live here too. I have rights. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I'd labeled documentation. 6 weeks of meticulous evidence gathering, organized with the same precision I brought to patient charts at the hospital. Actually, Jason, you don't have any rights here, I said calmly. You've never been on the lease. You've never paid rent. You have no legal claim to this apartment whatsoever. But we've been together for 6 years. 6 years during which you've contributed approximately $8,400 to our household expenses, I interrupted, reading from my spreadsheet. That's an average of $116 per month, which doesn't even cover your beer budget, let alone rent, utilities, groceries, or any of the other expenses I've been handling alone. Jason's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. He'd grown so comfortable with his financial irresponsibility that he'd never considered someone might actually calculate the numbers. You kept track of money? He asked, as if the concept of financial accountability was foreign to him. I kept track of everything, I replied, and something in my tone made him take a step backward. The movers continued their work with professional efficiency, wrapping my books in tissue paper, carefully packing the kitchen equipment I'd accumulated over years of being the only person who cooked. Jason stood in his boxers, watching strangers dismantle the life he'd assumed would continue indefinitely, and for the first time in 6 years, he seemed to be grasping the reality of his situation. "Where are you going?" he asked, and I could hear genuine panic creeping into his voice. "Somewhere you'll never find me," I said simply. "This is insane, Cassandra. You can't just disappear without talking to me first. We can work this out. If you're unhappy with our arrangement, we can negotiate." "Negotiate?" I laughed, and Jason flinched at the sound. "Jason, there's nothing to negotiate. You've spent 6 years treating me like a convenient service provider, while telling your friends I'm lucky you tolerate my existence. What exactly would you like to negotiate?" "I never said that." I pulled up the screenshots I'd taken of his group text conversations and held the phone where he could see them. Jason's face went pale as he recognized his own words. "I've got her trained pretty good, and why work when you've got a nurse girlfriend? It's like having a sugar mama who actually believes she's getting something out of it." "Would you like me to read these out loud?" I asked. "Or should I skip to the part where you told Martin you could cheat on me, and I'd probably apologize for making you do it?" Jason grabbed for the phone, but I pulled it back smoothly. 6 years of living with someone who'd rather deflect than take responsibility had taught me to anticipate his reactions. "Those were just jokes," he said desperately. "Guys talk trash sometimes. It doesn't mean anything." "You're right," I agreed. "It doesn't mean anything. Just like our relationship doesn't mean anything. Just like your promises to contribute don't mean anything. Just like your claims of loving me don't mean anything." One of the movers appeared in the living room doorway. "Ma'am, we're ready for the bedroom furniture. The bed, dresser, and nightstands." "Just the dresser and my nightstand," I clarified. "The bed stays with the apartment." Jason's head snapped toward me. "That's our bed. We bought it together." I pulled out another document from my phone, a credit card statement from 3 years ago. "Actually, I bought it with my credit card. After you assured me you'd pay me back when your consulting opportunities started generating income." The pattern of evidence was overwhelming, and I could see Jason beginning to realize just how thoroughly I'd documented his financial parasitism. But the credit card statements and expense tracking were just the surface level of my investigation. "You want to know what I really discovered during my research, Jason?" I asked, settling into the armchair that would be leaving with the movers in about 20 minutes. "It wasn't just the money, it was the systematic way you've been lying about everything." "I haven't been lying. Your LinkedIn profile says you're a strategic development consultant who's been building client relationships for the past 2 years, I continued. "But you've been unemployed for 8 months, and before that your longest job lasted 6 weeks. Jason's face flushed red. "LinkedIn is about presenting your best professional image. Your dating profiles were particularly interesting," I said, and watched him freeze completely. 3 different apps, all active within the past 6 months. Photos taken in this apartment, descriptions of yourself as financially independent and recently out of a relationship with someone who didn't understand your entrepreneurial ambitions. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the movers seemed to pause their work, sensing the tension in the room. "How did you find them?" "Jason, you used the same email address for everything. The same password, the same photos. You're not as clever as you think you are." I pulled up one of his dating profiles and began reading aloud. "Successful entrepreneur looking for someone who shares my values of independence and ambition. Recently ended a long-term relationship with someone who was too focused on traditional expectations instead of supporting creative endeavors." "Creative endeavors," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling 6 years of unemployment now?" Jason looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The confident, manipulative man who'd spent years gaslighting me into believing I was the problem in our relationship had been reduced to someone who couldn't even defend his own lies. "But the dating profiles weren't even the worst part," I continued. "The worst part was discovering that you've been stealing from me." "I never stole anything. You've been using my credit cards without permission, small amounts, hoping I wouldn't notice. Coffee shops, gas stations, online purchases. Always under $50, always with the assumption that I was too stupid or too busy to track every transaction. I showed him another set of screenshots, credit card statements with charges highlighted in yellow. Dozens of them over the past year, totaling nearly $800 in unauthorized purchases. That's not stealing, Jason protested weakly. We share expenses. We don't share anything, Jason. I pay for everything while you take whatever you want. There's a difference, and it's called theft. The movers had finished with the living room and were heading toward the bedroom. In less than an hour, everything that belonged to me would be gone, and Jason would be standing alone in a nearly empty apartment that he couldn't afford and had never deserved. You can't do this to me, he said, his voice taking on a whining quality I'd heard hundreds of times before. Where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to pay rent? The same way every other adult manages their life, I replied. Get a job, any job, pay your own bills. Take responsibility for your own survival, but I don't have any money saved, because you've been spending it on beer and video games instead of planning for your future. That's not my problem anymore, Jason. That's your problem. I stood up as the movers carried my dresser past the living room window. In 30 minutes, I would walk out of this apartment and never look back. Jason would finally be forced to confront the reality of what his life looked like, without someone else subsidizing his existence. You'll regret this, he said, and for the first time that morning, his voice carried a hint of the old manipulative anger. You think you're so independent, but you'll come crawling back. You need me more than you realize. I looked at him, really looked at him, one final time. A 36-year-old man in his underwear, surrounded by the evidence of his own inadequacy, still believing that the woman he'd systematically abused would eventually return to take care of him. Goodbye, Jason, I said quietly. I hope you figure out how to take care of yourself. And with that, I walked toward the door to supervise the final stages of my disappearance from his life. What Jason didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that my disappearance hadn't been a spontaneous decision born from anger or hurt feelings. It had been a carefully orchestrated exit strategy developed with professional guidance from people who understood exactly what I'd been living through. 3 weeks after reading those devastating text messages, I'd made the most important phone call of my adult life. Women's Crisis Support Center. This is Amanda speaking. How can I help you? I was sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot during my lunch break, 20 miles from home where Jason couldn't accidentally overhear. My hands were shaking as I held the phone, not because I was scared, but because saying the words out loud would make everything real. I think I might be in an emotionally abusive relationship, I said quietly, and I need help figuring out how to leave safely. The conversation that followed changed everything. Amanda didn't ask me whether Jason hit me. She understood that abuse comes in many forms, and financial control combined with emotional manipulation can be just as devastating as physical violence. She didn't question whether my situation was serious enough to warrant intervention. She simply listened and then connected me with resources I never knew existed. What you're describing is a classic pattern, Amanda told me after I'd explained our dynamic. Financial abuse, social isolation, gaslighting about your competence and worth, systematic erosion of your independence. These are deliberate tactics designed to keep you trapped. Hearing my experience labeled with clinical terms was both validating and terrifying. Validating because it meant I wasn't crazy, oversensitive, or imagining the problems in our relationship. Terrifying because it meant I'd been living in an abusive situation for years without recognizing it. The good news, Amanda continued, is that you have advantages many women in your situation don't have. You have a stable income, professional credentials, and no children tying you to your abuser. You can plan your exit strategically. She connected me with Sarah Martinez, a legal advocate who specialized in helping women navigate the practical aspects of leaving financially abusive relationships. Sarah had been through this process hundreds of times, and her expertise was exactly what I needed to transform my desperate desire to escape into a concrete plan of action. The most important thing, Sarah explained during our first meeting at a coffee shop in Boulder, is to gather documentation before you make any moves. Financial abusers are often excellent at rewriting history, making their victims look unstable or vindictive. You need evidence. Sarah taught me how to document everything systematically, not just the obvious things like bank statements and expense records, but the subtle patterns of control and manipulation that had become so normalized I'd stopped noticing them. Screenshot every text message where he dismisses your concerns or makes you question your perception of events, she advised. Save emails where he pressures you about money or criticizes your professional decisions. Keep a daily log of conversations where he undermines your confidence or isolates you from support systems. The documentation process was emotionally brutal but absolutely necessary. Rereading 6 years of text conversations, I could see the gradual progression of Jason's manipulation tactics. Early messages where he'd been charming and supportive, slowly giving way to criticism, control, and contempt. But Sarah also connected me with Dr. Jennifer Chen, a therapist who specialized in recovery from emotional abuse. Dr. Chen helped me understand that my confusion about whether Jason's behavior was really that bad was itself a symptom of the psychological damage he'd inflicted. Healthy relationships don't require you to constantly question your own sanity, Dr. Chen explained during our second session. When you find yourself wondering if you're overreacting to treatment that makes you feel terrible, that's usually a sign that your reality has been systematically distorted. Working with Dr. Chen, I began to recognize patterns I'd been unconsciously adapting to for years. The way I'd learned to preemptively manage Jason's moods, editing my own needs and desires to avoid triggering his defensiveness. The way I'd internalized his criticism until I genuinely believed I was difficult, demanding, and lucky to be loved by someone so patient with my flaws. Your partner has trained you to prioritize his comfort over your own well-being, Dr. Chen observed. Recovery means learning to trust your own judgment again, to believe that your needs and feelings are valid even when someone else dismisses them. The financial guidance came from Maria Santos, a certified financial planner who worked with domestic violence survivors. Maria helped me understand that my fear of leaving Jason wasn't really about love. It was about the practical terror of starting over financially after years of having my economic independence systematically undermined. You're not financially dependent on him, Maria pointed out after reviewing my income and expenses. He's financially dependent on you. The relationship has been so psychologically destructive that you've lost sight of your own economic power. Maria helped me calculate exactly what my life would cost without Jason's expenses dragging me down. The numbers were shocking. Without funding his lifestyle, I could afford a better apartment, save money consistently, and even pursue the graduate degree I'd abandoned years earlier. Financial abuse works by convincing victims they can't survive independently, Maria explained. But you've been surviving independently for years, you've just been supporting someone else's dependence at the same time. The most crucial support came from Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who worked with the Domestic Violence Unit. Lisa helped me understand my legal rights and options, ensuring that my exit strategy wouldn't leave me vulnerable to retaliation or harassment. Emotional and financial abuse often escalates when the victim tries to leave, Lisa warned. Your abuser may attempt to sabotage your credit, harass you at work, or use social manipulation to undermine your support systems. We need to prepare for those possibilities. Lisa helped me secure a protective order that would go into effect immediately if Jason attempted to contact me after I left. She also connected me with an attorney who specialized in financial crimes, just in case Jason's unauthorized use of my credit cards needed to be addressed legally. The key is to disappear completely, Lisa advised. Don't tell him where you're going. Don't give him opportunities to negotiate or manipulate you into staying. Clean break, no contact, no information he can use to track you down. Working with this team of professionals, I realized that what I'd been calling a relationship was actually a carefully constructed system of exploitation. Jason hadn't gradually become selfish and manipulative. He'd been showing me exactly who he was from the beginning, and I'd been working so hard to see the best in him that I'd ignored the evidence of my own experiences. But more importantly, I learned that leaving an abusive relationship isn't about finding the courage to walk away. It's about developing the skills and resources to stay away. The network of support I'd built would continue helping me rebuild my life long after Jason became a distant memory. When I finally walked out of that apartment on March 15th, I wasn't just escaping one toxic relationship. I was stepping into a new version of myself, supported by people who understood that healing from abuse requires more than just physical distance. It requires learning to trust your own perceptions again, to believe you deserve better treatment, and to build a life that reflects your own values rather than someone else's convenience. Jason thought he was losing his meal ticket. What he'd actually lost was his control over someone who'd finally remembered she'd never needed him in the first place. The night before moving day, I sat in what would be my last bath in that apartment, surrounded by the evidence of 6 years I was about to erase. But instead of feeling sad or nostalgic, I felt something I hadn't experienced in so long I'd forgotten what it was called: anticipation for my own future. My phone buzzed with final confirmations. The moving company ready for 8 a.m. pickup, Boulder Community Hospital, confirming my start date for Monday. My new apartment complex, with keys ready for afternoon pickup. Each message was another thread in the safety net I'd woven for myself, while Jason played video games in the next room, completely oblivious to the fact that his world was about to collapse. I had spent weeks perfecting every detail of my disappearance, not because I was afraid of Jason physically, he was too lazy for violence, but because I understood that the most dangerous moment in any abusive relationship is when the victim asserts their independence. Jason's sense of entitlement was so profound that losing his source of financial support might trigger desperate attempts to maintain control. That's why I'd opened bank accounts he didn't know existed, rerouted my mail to a P.O. box, and arranged for my new job to start immediately. By the time Jason realized I wasn't coming back, I'd be financially independent, professionally established, and legally protected in a new city where he couldn't casually show up to manipulate me back into funding his lifestyle. The most satisfying part of my preparation had been the careful inventory of what belonged to whom. Jason had lived so completely off my earnings that he'd never bothered to purchase anything substantial for our shared life. The furniture, electronics, kitchen equipment, even the coffee maker he used every morning, all of it had been bought with my money, which meant all of it was coming with me. What Jason would wake up to tomorrow afternoon was an empty apartment containing only the items he'd actually contributed: his gaming chair, his clothes, his collection of empty beer cans, and the PlayStation system his mother had bought him for Christmas. The physical manifestation of his 6-year contribution to our relationship could fit in the back of a pickup truck. As I drained the bathtub and prepared for my final night sleeping next to the man who'd spent years convincing me I was unlovable, I felt a profound sense of closure. Not the romantic closure that comes from mutual understanding and amicable parting, but the practical closure that comes from solving a problem completely. I slept better that night than I had in months. Morning came with the precision of a military operation. I woke before my alarm, dressed quietly, and sat in the kitchen making final phone calls, while Jason snored through what would be his last morning of subsidized comfort. "Everything ready on your end?" Sarah Martinez asked when I called to confirm the final legal protections were in place. "All set," I replied. "The restraining order paperwork is filed, my new employer has been briefed about potential harassment, and Detective Rodriguez has my new contact information." "Remember," Sarah said, "no matter what he says today, no matter how he reacts, you don't owe him explanations or negotiations. You've already given him 6 years of opportunities to treat you with basic respect." By 7:45 a.m., I could hear the moving truck rumbling up our street. My heart rate stayed perfectly steady as I opened the door to let the team in, not because I wasn't nervous, but because I'd planned so thoroughly that nervousness felt unnecessary. "Miss Rossi," the lead mover confirmed, "we're ready to get started." "Perfect," I replied. "Let me wake up my ex-boyfriend so he can witness his eviction." As I walked toward the bedroom to begin the final act of this performance, I carried with me the knowledge that by sunset, Jason Reynolds would be nothing more than an expensive lesson I'd finally finished learning. The woman who'd spent 6 years believing she was lucky to be tolerated was about to show him exactly what he'd lost. The movers worked with the efficiency of people who'd done this before, who understood that sometimes packing up a life needed to happen quickly and completely. Within 2 hours, they'd systematically dismantled everything that made our apartment feel like home, leaving behind only the hollow shell of Jason's actual contributions to our shared life. Jason had progressed through several stages of panic during the process. First, disbelief, surely this was some elaborate bluff designed to get his attention. Then bargaining, offering to work harder on finding employment and be more appreciative of everything I did for us. When those tactics failed, he'd moved into anger, pacing around the apartment in his boxers, demanding explanations I had no intention of providing. "You can't just abandon 6 years of relationship without giving me a chance to fix things," he shouted, as the movers carried my bookshelf past the living room window. "This is insane, Cassandra. People don't just disappear from each other's lives like this." I was standing by the kitchen counter, checking items off my moving inventory with the same methodical precision I used for patient charts at the hospital. Each marked box represented another piece of my identity being restored, another aspect of my life that would no longer be filtered through Jason's needs and opinions. "Actually, people disappear from toxic situations all the time," I replied calmly. "It's called self-preservation." "Toxic?" Jason's voice cracked with indignation. "I've supported you for 6 years. I've been there for you through every stress, every problem, every crisis. How is that toxic?" I looked up from my clipboard and studied his face. Even now, standing in an apartment being emptied of everything he'd assumed belonged to him, Jason genuinely believed he'd been the supportive partner in our relationship. The depth of his self-deception was almost impressive. "Jason," I said quietly, "in what way have you supported me? Specifically, give me one concrete example of you making my life better, rather than easier for yourself." The silence that followed was deafening. Jason's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. After 6 years of relationship, he couldn't identify a single instance where he'd prioritized my well-being over his own comfort. "I've been emotionally supportive," he finally stammered. "I've listened to you complain about work, helped you process your feelings." "You mean you've sat there while I vented about 12-hour shifts, then immediately redirected conversations back to your own problems?" I interrupted. "That's not emotional support, Jason. That's just being present while someone else does the emotional labor." My phone buzzed with a text from the moving company driver, "Loading complete, ready for departure in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. 10 minutes, until Jason would be alone with the consequences of 6 years of choices he'd never had to fully confront before. "Where are you going?" he asked. And for the first time all morning, his voice carried genuine desperation rather than entitled anger. "Somewhere you'll never find me," I said, and I meant it. Boulder was far enough away to require intentional effort to reach, but more importantly, I'd built a life there that existed completely outside Jason's sphere of influence. New job, new apartment, new social connections, an entire existence he couldn't touch or manipulate. "This is about money, isn't it?" Jason said, grasping for any explanation that didn't require him to examine his own behavior. "You think I'm some kind of financial burden." I pulled out my phone one final time and showed him the spreadsheet I'd compiled during my weeks of research. "You've contributed $8,400 to our household over 6 years, Jason. I spent more than that on your personal expenses just in the past 8 months. The color drained from his face as he stared at the numbers. "You actually kept track?" "I kept track of everything," I confirmed. "Your unemployment periods, your job applications, your spending habits, your dating profiles, your conversations with friends where you called me a sugar mama who was too stupid to know she was being used." Jason stumbled backward like I'd physically hit him. "How did you find out?" "Jason, you left your phone unlocked on the bathroom counter. You saved passwords in browsers you thought I'd never check. You were so confident in my stupidity that you never bothered to hide your contempt." The lead mover appeared in the doorway. "Rossi, we're ready to head to the new location. Do you need a few more minutes?" I looked around the apartment one final time. The walls looked smaller without my furniture, cheaper without my decorations, emptier without the warmth I'd tried so hard to create in a space that was never really a home. "No," I said. "I'm ready." I picked up my purse and the single suitcase I'd packed with essentials for my first few days in Boulder. Everything else was already loaded in the truck, ready to be transported to a life where I'd never again have to justify my worth to someone who'd never deserved it. Cassandra, please, Jason said as I walked toward the door. Don't do this. We can work things out. I'll change, I promise. I'll get a job. I'll contribute more. I'll appreciate you the way you deserve. I paused at the threshold and turned back to look at him one last time. Standing there in his underwear, surrounded by the pathetic remnants of his actual contributions to our relationship, Jason looked exactly like what he was, a grown man who'd spent 6 years avoiding responsibility, and was now facing the consequences of that choice. Goodbye, Jason, I said simply. I hope you learn how to take care of yourself, and with that I walked out of his life forever. The drive to Boulder felt like traveling between two different worlds. In my rearview mirror, I could see the moving truck following at a careful distance, carrying everything that mattered from a life I was leaving behind. Ahead of me lay a city I'd chosen specifically because Jason had never shown any interest in visiting it, where I could rebuild my identity without the constant weight of his expectations and criticisms. But as the familiar skyline of Denver faded behind me, my phone started buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from Jason. What had begun as confused attempts to contact me had escalated into a barrage of texts that revealed the true depth of his desperation and his delusion. Cass, please come back. We can talk about this rationally. This is a huge overreaction. I know you're upset, but this isn't the solution. You're making a massive mistake. You won't survive on your own. I talked to Martin and he agrees you're being crazy. Come home. That last message made me laugh out loud as I drove through the mountains. Jason was so disconnected from reality that he thought consulting Martin Sanders, a 32-year-old man who lived in his parents' basement, would somehow validate his perspective on adult relationships. But the messages kept coming, and their tone shifted from pleading to angry to something approaching panic as the hours passed, and I didn't respond. Fine. If you want to be selfish and throw away everything we built together, that's your choice. You'll regret this when you realize how good you had it with me. I hope you're happy destroying 6 years of love over money. You've changed, Cass. You used to be caring and supportive. Now you're just cold and calculating. Each message was a perfect example of the gaslighting techniques that had kept me trapped for so long. Jason couldn't accept that I was leaving because his behavior was unacceptable, so he had to reframe my departure as evidence of my personal failings. In his mind, I wasn't escaping abuse. I was abandoning love because I'd become a different, worse person. What Jason didn't know was that every text he sent was being automatically forwarded to Detective Rodriguez as part of the harassment documentation we'd established. Sarah Martinez had warned me that abusers often escalate their behavior when they lose control, and Jason's messages were following the predicted pattern perfectly. By evening, when I was settling into my new apartment 30 miles away, Jason's texts had taken on a more sinister tone. I know where you work. I can find you. You can't just disappear from someone's life like this. I have rights. You stole everything from our apartment. I'm calling the police. I'm going to tell everyone at the hospital what kind of person you really are. That final threat was the one that made me pick up the phone and call Detective Rodriguez directly. He's threatening to harass me at work, I told her, reading the messages aloud. This is exactly what we prepared for, she replied calmly. I'm activating the restraining order immediately. Jason will be served with papers tomorrow morning, and if he contacts you again or shows up at your workplace, he'll be arrested. What if he actually follows through on his threats? Then he'll discover that stalking and harassment are felonies, and his problems will become much bigger than losing his free housing and meal ticket. The next morning I started my first day at Boulder Community Hospital, with the strange sensation of beginning my career over again. New colleagues who knew nothing about my personal history, new responsibilities that reflected my actual qualifications rather than the diminished version of myself I'd become over 6 years of psychological manipulation. During my lunch break, Detective Rodriguez called with an update. Jason was served with the restraining order this morning, she reported. The officer who delivered it said he seemed genuinely shocked that you'd taken legal action. Apparently, he kept insisting this was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a conversation. How did he react to the legal documentation of his harassment? According to the report, he tried to claim the text messages were taken out of context and that he never intended to threaten you. Classic abuser response, minimizing his actions while portraying himself as the victim. But the most satisfying news came later that week when Sarah Martinez called with information about Jason's attempts to challenge my disappearance. He contacted a lawyer about recovering his share of the furniture and belongings you took, she told me. The attorney apparently explained that since Jason never contributed financially to purchasing anything, never signed a lease, and never established legal residence, he has no claim to any property whatsoever. What about his threats to call the police? He did call them, claimed you'd stolen his belongings and abandoned him illegally. The responding officer reviewed the documentation, lease agreements, purchase receipts, bank statements, and informed Jason that you'd actually been incredibly generous by not pursuing charges for his unauthorized use of your credit cards. The image of Jason sitting in that empty apartment, calling police to report that his financial victim had escaped with her own possessions, was almost too perfect to believe. But it captured the essence of his worldview. Even facing complete abandonment, he couldn't conceive of himself as anything other than the wronged party. There's one more thing, Sarah added. The officer's report mentioned that Jason's mother showed up while they were taking his statement. Apparently, she'd received a rather desperate phone call about needing somewhere to stay temporarily. I felt a moment of genuine sympathy for Mrs. Reynolds, who'd spent 36 years watching her son avoid responsibility and was now being asked to subsidize his lifestyle once again. But my sympathy was tempered by the knowledge that enabling Jason's dependence had made him someone else's problem to solve. As I hung up the phone and returned to my new life, I realized that Jason's complete exposure had served a purpose beyond just ending our relationship. His threats, his harassment, his legal tantrums had all been documented by professionals who understood exactly what they were witnessing. Jason Reynolds would never be able to claim that Cassandra Rossi had been the problem in their relationship. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious, the outcome too predictable. He'd finally been forced to face the truth about himself, even if he lacked the emotional capacity to accept it. 6 months after walking out of Jason's life, I was sitting in my apartment in Boulder on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee and reading a book I'd chosen simply because I wanted to read it, not because someone else had opinions about how I spent my free time. The silence in my space wasn't the oppressive quiet of walking on eggshells around someone's mood swings. It was the peaceful silence of a life lived according to my own values and priorities. My phone rang, and Sarah Martinez's name appeared on the screen. "I have some news about Jason," she said after we exchanged pleasantries. "Are you interested in hearing it?" "Only if it's relevant to my safety," I replied. I'd worked hard to build a life where Jason Reynolds was a distant memory rather than an ongoing concern. "It's more about closure," Sarah said. "He's been evicted from the apartment." I wasn't surprised. The rent had been $1,800 per month, and Jason's sporadic income from occasional gig work couldn't have covered even basic utilities, let alone housing costs. What surprised me was that he'd lasted 6 months before losing the place entirely. His mother was helping him financially for a while, Sarah continued. But apparently she reached her limit when she discovered he'd been using the money she gave him for rent to buy a new gaming system instead. The image of Jason prioritizing video games over housing, while facing homelessness, was so perfectly characteristic that I had to laugh. Even complete desperation couldn't motivate him to make responsible choices about his own survival. Where is he now? Living in his friend Martin's basement. According to my contact at the courthouse, Jason tried to sue you for abandonment and financial damages, but the case was dismissed when he couldn't provide evidence of any legal relationship or shared assets. I felt a profound sense of validation hearing that the legal system had confirmed what I'd known all along. Jason had never been my partner in any meaningful sense. He'd been a dependent who'd convinced himself he was entitled to support indefinitely. But more importantly, I'd built something beautiful in the space his absence had created. My job at Boulder Community Hospital had exceeded every expectation. Working with colleagues who respected my judgment, who valued my contributions, who treated me like the competent professional I'd always been reminded me of who I was before Jason's systematic erosion of my confidence. I'd been promoted to senior charge nurse within 4 months, and I was already making plans to pursue my master's degree in healthcare administration. My savings account had grown to $15,000, more money than I'd been able to accumulate during 6 years of funding Jason's lifestyle. Without his constant drain on my resources, I could afford not just survival but actual prosperity. I was planning a vacation to Europe, something I'd dreamed about for years, but had never been able to justify while supporting someone else's beer budget. Most importantly, I'd rediscovered friendships that Jason's jealousy and manipulation had nearly destroyed. Sarah from nursing school had become a regular part of my life again, along with colleagues who invited me to social events I actually wanted to attend. I joined a hiking group, started taking photography classes, and begun volunteering at a women's shelter, using my experience to help other women recognize and escape financial abuse. "You seem really happy," my sister Emma had observed during her visit last month. "Like yourself again, but stronger."
She was right.
The woman I'd become wasn't the same person who'd fallen in love with Jason Reynolds in college. She was someone who'd learned to trust her own perceptions, who'd discovered that being alone was infinitely preferable to being with someone who diminished her worth. She was someone who understood that love without respect was just elaborate manipulation, that partnership required actual contribution from both parties. I'd also learned that my fear of leaving Jason had been completely unfounded. The practical aspects of living independently, managing finances, making decisions, handling problems, turned out to be significantly easier when I wasn't constantly accommodating someone else's learned helplessness. The emotional aspects of being single were challenging at first, but ultimately liberating when I realized I could trust my own judgment about what made me happy. 3 weeks ago, I'd gone on my first date since leaving Jason, coffee with David, an emergency room physician who'd joined our hospital staff recently. When he'd asked about my previous relationships, I'd given him an honest but brief summary of what I'd learned about recognizing incompatible values in potential partners. "You seem like someone who really knows what she wants," he'd said, and it was the best compliment I'd received in years. As I finished my coffee and prepared to start my weekend, hiking with friends, working on my photography portfolio, maybe cooking an elaborate dinner just because I felt like it, I reflected on the year that had changed everything. Jason Reynolds had been wrong about so many things, but he'd been absolutely right about one: I would never leave him. I'd done something much more powerful instead. I'd erased him from my life so completely that his cruel laughter had become nothing more than the sound of a man I used to know, discovering what he'd lost when he mistook strength for weakness and independence for desperation, and I'd never been happier. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.